Hey, everybody. Mark and I have over 20 years of experience as therapists and as addicts in long term successful recovery. We know better than anyone what works and what doesn't to break out of porn and sex addiction, heal betrayal trauma, and reclaim your relationship.
And we've poured all of our personal and professional recovery and healing experience into a first of its kind program for addicts, spouses, and couples. We call it Dare to Connect.
At least 4 times every week, we engage with you in real time, in the trenches, giving you the knowledge and the tools to take back your life and relationship.
Whatever else you've done on your journey for healing and recovery, you've never done anything like this.
Mark and I, we've made all the mistakes, so you don't have to. Don't reinvent the wheel.
We all know tomorrow never comes. Look, don't wait one more day to change. Claim your free 2-week trial today at daretoconnectnow.com.
Hey, everybody. I'm Steve Moore.
And I'm Mark Castleman.
We know the pain and heartbreak of porn and sex addiction.
And we know the triumph of breaking completely free.
Every day, we help our clients find hope and healing.
Join us in the fight to take back your life, your marriage, and be stronger than ever.
This is the PBSC Squared podcast.
Hey, everybody. Mark and Steve on the PBSC podcast. This is episode 240. This one's a little different. Steve, you and I were talking. I don't think we've ever done an episode on this specific topic.
No, I don't think that we have. We've had lots of discussions about it off air and, as we've been going to D2C sessions and things, but yeah, we haven't. I don't think we've ever addressed it on the podcast.
Yeah, so you'll see the title, What are the differences and similarities between male and female betrayal-traumatized partners? And so this comes from a guy who is actually writing to us in PBSC as a betrayed partner.
Yes.
And so here's what he says. How do male betrayed partners process betrayal trauma differently than female betrayed partners? What are the difficulties male partners have when trying to heal the relationship with their betrayer? Are there any differences in recovery and repair between male betrayed / female sex addicts versus female betrayed / male sex addict? So he says, I've been attending 12 steps for codependents for sex addicts and have only met one other guy in my situation. Also struggling to find any literature or resources on this topic. And then he just gives a little bit of personal background that it's been 5 weeks since the big discovery of her betrayal toward him. She's in long-term treatment. They've both been involved in 12-step groups for actually a long time.
Yes.
Looks like 8 years. Looks like they both have had chemical dependency issues, each of them. And they have both been in, for example, AA for a really long time. And they have children.
Yep. Young kids together the better part of a decade.
Yep. They've been, been together the better part of a decade. And
a lot on the line for this coupleship for sure.
And Steve, you and I were talking about this before we actually recorded. We both actually liked the fact that this had come in because and we know the reasons for this, but there's a very cultural thing out there where in nearly everything that's written about or talked about, it's the male porn sex addict and the female betrayed partner. And while that is largely true in many cases, I think that there are some disadvantages and some cultural issues that make recovery and healing more difficult in some ways when it becomes too stereotyped like that.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about that a little bit today, right? We're to be careful that it's not just an ironclad gender-based issue, but it's more of a human beings-based issue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Going to look at
No,
that.
absolutely. Because it really is. I mean, now it's true that there are definitely some unique elements at play, but
There are.
uh, the more Mark and I have done this work over time, the more we, and the more clients we've encountered. First of all, I guess obviously ought to give a bit of a disclaimer today. What we're going to be talking about today really is this is not research based. Okay. We don't have any clinical research to back this up. What you're getting is the combined experience from a couple of therapists who've been doing this for decades. So what we've seen in our clinics, what we've observed in our own recovery circles, those kinds of things. Um, but that being said, there is definitely, we would say, some validity to it, but just please take it for what it is. It doesn't, this won't, we cannot speak to every demographic or creed today. We're just going to touch on this issue as much as practicality allows.
Yeah.
But when you really start to dive into this, I would say that for anyone who experiences betrayal, right, there are some key factors that are across the board, right? Man, woman, does not matter. Um, because betrayal trauma is still betrayal trauma at the end of the day.
Yeah.
We are all human beings, and there are many components to both betrayal and then also to the healing piece, right? If we define betrayal trauma really quick, we've covered this many times on the podcast, so just a quick summary, right? More or less, betrayal trauma is what occurs in an intimate relationship when one partner, through a variety of means or methods, in this case, we're talking along the sexual or emotionally intimate spectrum, uh, is operating under some sort of a deceptive paradigm. And when the other partner, through again a variety of means, discovers this, there is essentially an emotional, financial, and relational falling out in the relationship.
Yeah.
Right.
The bottom falls out, right?
Yep. The person's entire worldview is impacted by it.
Yeah, and I love how you've referred to this over the years, Steve. Is it's this traumatic paradigm shift from what was, what I thought was, to what is.
Yes.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Right. And there's that, and it's the brain's, that actual betrayal piece is the essentially the ripping away of that old paradigm. And now the exploratory, difficult process of figuring out what actually is, right? And there are so many issues around trust and things that complicate that. And every betrayal trauma itself is different, right? And we've talked about in past podcasts about some of the differences. One of the biggest ones, for example, is the methodology of disclosure.
hmm
It's well known that what is referred to as a staggered disclosure, right, where little truths are either shared on the part of the betrayer or discovered by the betrayee over time, is hands down far and away the most tragic and traumatic and damaging approach to the process. But you can see there's a wide variance in whether an addict is disclosing things, how transparent they are versus not, how much blame shifting and other ego defense mechanisms are in place versus not, right? There's a whole spectrum there. And those things, as far as across the board go, I would say that when it comes to the male or female difference, I don't think we really see much as far as differences go that way in at least in terms of the harm done. Um, at least again in my observation in time, Mark, if you have anything to add that way, I
and yeah, that whole disclosure process is such a broad topic that has so many moving
it is.
parts,
It is.
right? But when you get into trickled or staggered disclosure over time, right, from the addict side, whether male or female, often trickled disclosure or staggered is because we're deathly afraid of what's going to happen to our reputation, to the relationship, to our world if it all comes out at once. So we think that we will do damage control by just letting it out a little bit at a time. And when that happens, of course, on the betrayed partner side, now they get into a place where it becomes layered trauma heaped upon trauma. And now
Yes.
we get into what we call complex trauma, which is a whole other area. And now I become hyper vigilant as a partner, waiting for the next shoe to drop, right? There's just all kinds of stuff that happens with that.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, that's whether I'm it's a male or a female that's on the betrayed or the betrayer or betrayee side. You're both going to experience those things depending on which side of the street you're on that.
Yes, absolutely. And there's a whole list of factors that have to be addressed, regardless of whether you're male or female, as a betrayed partner, right?
Mhm.
Um, I mean, we'll just go down the list for sake of time here. We're looking at things like reframing or repairing individual worth and value.
Oh,
I
that is,
mean,
we are right in the thick of the topic of enmeshment,
yes,
our Dare to Connect program. And just today, in our session today, Steve, we talked about this. How do you break out of being enmeshed with others to have and perceive your worth and value as based on another human being versus
yes.
becoming an autonomous, sovereign, independent being that isn't dependent on others for your worth and value.
Yep, establishing that all on your own.
And when betrayal comes, boy, does that hit you in the face.
Mm.
If you've had any dependency on someone else for your worth and value, and now that whole connection or relationship, right, is like an atomic bomb has been dropped on it. Now you're standing there going, who am I? What am I? Where's my worth, my value? Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
You're right. Reframing and repairing what that means to have individual worth and value is huge.
So that bullet point alone, I mean, that's hours and hours
It
and
is.
podcasts of discussion, right?
It is.
But then we have equally other elements that are just as difficult to navigate, right? Reframing or repairing attachment to the partner. What is that even going to look like? Right? Are we staying together? Are we not? If we do, what is that going to look like? What's that going to entail? What's going to be needed in the healing process? Healing trauma and attachment issues just itself. One of the things that we see, and we mention this often on here, is that the more intimate the betrayal, the more devastating the ripples that come off of it. And
Absolutely.
in other words, the brain, among other things, think of it like a hierarchy in the brain, right? When we talk about different levels of intimacy with different relationships, for most people, that committed relationship that a person is in is, if not the top, at least one of the top pinnacles for trust, connection, and intimacy. And
Mhm.
when the bottom falls out on that relationship, it has a reciprocal devastating effect on any other relationships, quote unquote, down the totem pole,
Yes.
right? And it looks through that lens of, well, if this person is capable of these things, of the deception, of the hurt, of doing this kind of damage to me, right? And given the facts that I knew him as well as I did, I was as connected with them as I was as involved with them emotionally and sexually in every other way possible, and this still happened. Well, then what about all the people that I do know that I don't sleep with or haven't built a life with or say that they love me or care about me? Can I even trust those relationships?
Yeah. And
Right.
the other thing with regard to this attachment is sometime, well, I'd say most of the time when a betrayal like this happens, we confront sometimes for the first time in our lives our attachment styles,
Yeah,
right? The way we learn
absolutely.
to attach as kids and teenagers, and suddenly we go, "Oh my gosh, I have this. I have anxious attachment to style, or I disconnect and detach." Right? There's a lot of this for the first. This is what you and I find, Steve, in our practices is things that couples would never have realized, confronted, or become aware of. Suddenly, in a betrayal, it all comes to the forefront.
It does.
They're like, what is
Absolutely.
this? Right? They didn't even realize they had it. They had these issues. And so one of the
Absolutely.
things, that we have listed here is rebuilding the capacity for trust. And this is where it gets really tricky. Not just suddenly rebuilding, having to have shattered the trust in others and to rebuild the trust in others, but what about the trust in yourself?
Our own gut, right? Our
Yeah,
own
if
intuition.
if he or she could have been deceiving me all these years or decades and pulling the wool over my eyes and fooling me, what does that say about me?
I must be an idiot. I must
Yeah,
be a
right.
moron. I must be stupid. How could I have let this happen?
Yeah.
Very, very difficult, complex issues, which by the way, ties into one the couple of bullet points down for us, which is navigating the inherent shame issues that
Oh
arise
my gosh, isn't
as
that
a
true?
result of this, right? The inadequacy and the feeling like you're not enough and you're not chosen and the reasons why. And I mean that again, each of these, we've got 7 or 8 bullet points here, and this represents a couple of years worth of sessions. Well, and speaking of things on this list that are difficult to address, last but not least on here, right, would be the handling of triggers, right, in the future.
Mm.
So now that I've gone through this traumatic experience, right, everyone knows I'm big on analogies. Whenever I picture trauma, or especially complex trauma taking place in a person's world, I just picture somebody scattering. It's like we're looking down their thread of time, right? Or their kind of timeline into the future. And it's like somebody's walking down the row, just spreading from a basket from hell, just little landmines,
Little
right?
mines. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Into the future,
Yeah,
right? These little cues.
I had a client years ago who not only he had addiction issues because he also had post traumatic stress. He was a veteran, and he used to share in group how absolutely horrifying these triggers were for him. Right, he comes back from deployment. He's walking down the street, fine, having a great day. A car backfires. That
Hmm.
sound. Next thing he knows, when he quote comes to himself consciously, is he's in the fetal position behind a dumpster, shivering.
Yeah.
It's completely overcome, right?
Mm,
Triggers.
yeah.
Yeah.
And they are very real, and they can be really anything in the environment, right? That references the brain back to, these
Anything.
difficult issues.
Yeah.
So anyway, we've covered all those elements to the trauma side before, but these are things that are universal. Man, woman, it doesn't matter. We all have to face and navigate those issues. So those are unavoidable facts and factors that we have to address.
Yes.
Now let's get into, as we get to the kind of the second half of this podcast, the actual question, right? There are differences between the healing tracks for men and women, and most of them, I would say, or we would say, lie in what we would call the cultural differences, right? Present. Um, Culture encompasses a huge wide range,
It
right, of
does.
factors and elements.
And we should talk about right up front, that whole cultural and gender issue. It's a very complex arena. We
Oh
are
yeah,
not
it's
in any
huge.
way talking about anything but scratching the surface on this. But let's talk about why it's important to understand these male female differences in the culture, because wherever you find yourself, whether you're the one who's been betraying because of porn or sex addiction, or you're on the other side where you've been betrayed, it's very important to understand where you come from in your family of origin, in your religious experience, in your gender role experience, so that you can understand where you need to go from here with regard to healing, with regard to hopefully mending and repairing a relationship, right? Where have you come from in these differences for yourself? Really important to just try to recognize those right up front. Okay, what does that look like for me? Right? Have you looked at it before? What did that look like in the family you grew up in? Male and female role differences. Right? I know for me that had a dramatic impact on how I saw things and how that happened for me later. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, and you know, when we talk about this wide span, I mean, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here, right? I mean, we'll start from kind of the inwards and work out, right? Family of origin, in and of itself, is its own culture, right?
Yes.
With a whole wide range of approaches and views to everything under the sun, including attachment, including grieving. My mom, for example, grew up in a household where the message was very clear. In fact, if I remember right, don't quote me on it, but I believe it was actually said in her household growing up, we don't cry in this family. That doesn't happen here, right? Like that is not something that Ashtons do. And
Right.
if it wasn't stated outright, it was definitely implied.
Well, it's
Um,
interesting you said that about your mom, because normally the thing we don't cry would be, real men don't cry. You're saying this about
yes.
your mother,
Well, this is my mother's family of origin,
right? But
right?
she,
Yeah.
as a girl, she was told that that wasn't acceptable as a girl.
Growing up, hands down, my father before he passed away was definitely more of the nurturing parent than my mother was,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And that's just one key example, right? But I mean, there's 100 of those, where, for example, emoting, and this is kind of implied in the one I just said, emoting is, for example, viewed as a weakness, right? If I express
Showing
some sort
emotion.
of grieving
Mhm.
or issues that way, that is a total weakness, right? Um, but it also goes far beyond that too. It isn't even just a case of those family of origin. So we could talk about that all day. We won't for sake of time. But then let's just talk about gender roles in more of the global culture. For example, if we know we have listeners from all over the world,
Yeah.
and I've worked with a number of clients from South America and from Mexico. Machismo culture, machismo culture is huge,
Yeah.
in certain parts of the world, specifically in South America, right? There are very predefined, rigidly expected roles in certain subsets of South American culture around machismo and what that looks like, and what being quote unquote being the man it means in a family, what quote unquote being the woman in a family means, right? And that's just one unique example. You can find that in everywhere from North Africa to all over the globe, right? We have these different up styles of upbringings. What complicates this even more is one's religious or spiritual framework background, right? Do you hail more from a culture? Mark and I, we very much came from a culture of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and you don't rely on anybody. I came from a culture that was really weird in this area. It was totally socially acceptable and expected to serve everyone, but it was kind of culturally implied that if you accepted help, there was some sort of a deficit on your part.
Well, and we talked about this in Dare to Connect today about, we have this term healthy selfishness or healthy selfness, right? It came up. Well, what about, if we all relate to this very common analogy. You're sitting in a plane, the cabin is depressurized, the oxygen masks drop out of the ceiling, and who puts on the mask first? You do.
Yeah.
Well, unless you come from a certain religious or family, culture where taking care of yourself is called selfish. How dare
Mhm.
you, right? You're part of a unit, you're part of a team, you're part of a collective. How dare you try to be an individual with your needs and your wants?
Yeah,
Yeah, we talked a lot about that today in Dare to Connect.
for sure. Right. And
Other
so,
factor.
other existing in place support systems, right?
Mm,
When the trauma occurs, whatever, what does your friendship network look like? What do your family
uh,
member networks look like, right? All of those things go from being kind of this optional side part to life to all the holy crap. Now I'm having to rely on these systems that I may never have relied on before. And what is that going to entail? What's that going to look like,
yeah,
right?
who do I talk to? Who do I talk to about what? Right? What are
Yes,
the boundaries that are in place? We just a while back spent 2 whole months on boundaries
for,
in Dare to
for, for
Connect.
sure.
That's a whole issue.
One, whether it comes to machismo culture as an example, or even just what we see here in the states, right? Societal norms for processing and expressing grief are really serious barriers for male clients, statistically speaking, who are victims of betrayal, right? It can speak to all sorts of issues around shame, for example, around a guy's virility or sexuality, right? He must
Mhm.
not be good in bed. Why
Yeah.
in the world would she go and have now that it's not to say that can't happen on the female side too, right?
Oh,
But there are these different value sets that are tied to sexuality between men and women, again, based on culture and
yes,
all these other issues, right?
that's true.
Even simple things like, for example, grieving. There are many cultures that people hail from when it comes to, again, like machismo culture, where grief in some circles, again, not all, but in some circles, grieving better not involve, for example, tears, or you better not share that in public. That is something meant to be borne by you and you alone and nobody else. We
Mhm.
don't talk, even access to resources. There are cultures that downright frown on, for example, therapy,
Right.
right? Therapy is regarded as that's for nutso people.
Right.
If you go to therapy, you're nuts, right? I've actually had clients who have had friends who have outright told them that in different cultures all over the globe who've said you must be insane, not in a denigrating way, like in a literal way. Therapy is only for insane people.
Right.
You're not insane. Why are
Yeah,
you doing that?
that happens too.
Right. And so you can see how complicated this can become for anyone navigating this process. Acceptance of support from others. That alone, I just kind of mentioned that in my culture. There was if the religious congregation, if I that I grew up in, if the head of the congregation were to get up and say somebody needs help, we need 10 grand by the end of this service, that 10 grand would have showed up. But in that same congregation I grew up in, if the same leader of the congregation had said, "Hey, we've got 10 grand to assemble for somebody who really needs it. Somebody just needs to raise their hand and claim it." I don't think anybody would have raised their hand.
That's right.
Right? It's like this. We see, you can just see how complicated
Yeah.
this becomes,
Yeah.
and a lot of them do, admittedly, attend to or attach to those male gender expectation roles, right? That formulate from these different backgrounds we
Yeah.
come from.
Yeah. 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 Exactly. Yeah. There's and I think one of the big takeaways we wanted to really communicate to this guy that wrote into us is most And you tell me, Steve, if you're kind of in sync. I haven't really thought about how I was going to choose that word, but I think the vast majority of what we take betrayed partners through as their path of healing, I don't know that that would change much for whether the betrayed is a male or a female.
Mm.
There are some aspects of it, of course, that would be unique to whether they're whether they're male or female in that partnership. But I think a lot of it would be pretty universal. So a guy like this who
Yeah.
says, I can't find anything in the literature, there's no resources out there for somebody in my position as a guy, I'd say much of what you will find, for example, in betrayal trauma healing for women is going to be applicable to you.
Yes.
A lot of it.
Absolutely. Well, and if we've talked about this before on the program, but there are many versions out there for it, so we won't give any specific link. But if you were, for example, to do a Google search on the Griever's Bill of Rights, I mean, betrayal, among whatever else it is a grieving process.
Yeah, the
And if you ever
Griever's
look
Bill of
up a
Rights.
Griever's Bill of Rights, one of the first things you will see on any list is that there is no right or wrong way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that is just that, the truth. You need to feel whatever it is you feel, and you need to start whatever the method is for processing. That is probably the most key part, is that you start,
Yeah.
right? That you are expressing it, that you do have somewhere, some way to vent, to process those emotions. Because another precept of recovery, whether you're a man, woman, it spans the board, is that, and we talked about this in Dare to Connect today too. This is so weird. But when it comes to meeting our internal needs, including the need for grieving, including for the need for processing, your brain only gives you two options, and you're a fool if you think you have another. You can engage your prefrontal cortex to determine ways to do it, or you can sit back and allow your reptilian autonomic brain to find ways to cope or to compensate for you. Those are the options.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of how it gets done. And so starting the process, but we really do empathize with men, because we do recognize that if we were to speak to this globally for a minute, as far as the barriers go, if I was just to say in a global sense, those barriers around men feeling like they have the permission to be emotional, as well as the fact that maybe they don't have as much background in feeling and expressing emotions because of the culture they grow up in, they do experience some deficits there on probably a more common scale, right? They're just not as adept at it. It doesn't mean they're not capable of it, but they probably haven't practiced it as much.
And it wasn't mentored to them
No,
by other male adult figures around them.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so we can see why this guy writing in would find himself in a difficult spot where he feels alone. Right?
Yes.
What's out there for me? Right? So he's been in all these groups and he's only found one other guy in his position in all the years of going to 12-step support. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, guys, thank you so much for as always letting us into your hearts, your homes, and your relationships for a few minutes each week. If you like what you hear here, if you remotely like what you hear here, you will love and adore what you hear in Dare to Connect. So get your buns over to Dare Connect. We'd love to have you come join us. Come check out the 2-week free trial over at daretoconnectnow.com for over 6 hours of content a week. Of an ever-growing repository of both basic and advanced courses in the D2C Vault and D2C Academy, exercises, handouts, and everything in between as we help to navigate and level up your recovery journey with you. We'd love to be as much involved in that sense as you'll let us. Don't reinvent the wheel. Don't do what Mark and I did. That's what we did. We've reinvented the wheel, so God willing, you don't have to. Come join us, and you can find more information as well as that free trial at daretoconnectnow.com. And also, as always, we are quite a bit backed up on the podcast again. We've got a good probably 15 submissions of backlog right now that we're processing through. So for that immediate help, daretoconnectnow.com is where to turn. But you are welcome to continue to send us submissions for the podcast. We will continue to have it as long as you continue to watch it and to tune into it at pbscpodcast.com. There's a contact form there at the bottom that you can fill in to submit those, as well as a blog where you can search past podcast episodes as well.
Yeah, love it. All right, everybody. Hey, thanks for being with us here today, and we'll look forward to picking things back up on our next episode.
Take care, everybody. Bye. Everything expressed on the PBSC podcast are the opinions of the hosts and the participants, and is for informational and educational purposes only. This podcast should not be considered mental health therapy or as a substitute thereof. It is strongly recommended that you seek out the clinical guidance of an individual qualified mental health professional. If you're experiencing thoughts of suicide, self-harm, or a desire to harm others, please dial 911 or go to your nearest emergency room.